And we are back on the 0 Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. If you're watching on video, and if you're not, why not? But if you're watching on video, the object that I am holding in my hand is a book entitled Social Security Works for Everyone, exclamation point, protecting and expanding the insurance Americans love and count on. The co-author of that book is my good friend Nancy J. Altman, who joins us now. She co-wrote the book with Eric Kingston with a foreword by David K. Johnston. And I'm delighted to talk with her about it because I got a lot out of the book and because I've learned a great deal from Nancy and Eric about Social Security and about the history behind it, about the philosophy and the thinking behind it. And about what it means to strive for a society where the generations are woven together in a seamless thread of mutual support. So without any further ado, Nancy Altman, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a delight. And let's start with this. I have quoted your and Eric's line about the principles of quote unquote mutuality, reciprocity, and interdependence. And key to that, I think, is the line that you quote from Franklin D. Roosevelt, where he said that the Social Security Act, the act, of course, that brought Social Security into being, represents a cornerstone in a structure which is being built, but is by no means complete. Now, Nancy Altman, I take that to mean that, we've come to see Social Security as a thing, right? It's something people know about. You have your card, you expect to get it when you retire or if you're disabled. But to me, that means when FDR says this is a cornerstone in a structure, to me, he's saying he had something much bigger in mind, and that the words, if we strip themselves of what we associate with them with today in America, really mean something fundamental. Am I on the right track here?
You are absolutely on the right track. President Roosevelt was concerned about starting out too largely. This was the biggest undertaking the United States had ever taken on a domestic program. So the idea of making this program a success, they really wanted it to work well. So he decided to start out more modestly, but he envisioned there being universal health insurance. They talked about unemployment insurance as being simply a bridge between guaranteed employment, so that it was really supposed to be short-term because government would be an employer of last resort. They had thought about it as basic education, basic health. In fact, the first commissioner of Social Security, Arthur Altman, said that around the world, the United States really was one of the first countries to use the phrase Social Security. Around the world, it became known as synonymous with the good life, while in the United States, it became really focused on the program we think of as old age survivors disability insurance. But you're exactly right that President Roosevelt and those who were surrounding him and advising him and creating this program had a much more expansive concept of what Social Security was. Basic economic security is what they had in mind.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think that it feels to me that what's happened over the intervening, 85 years now, I guess, give or take, is that something has been lost. Something of the kind of, first of all, something of the poetry of the idea, if I can use that word, the vision. And that as the decades passed, of course, FDR passed away in 1945, and post-war, we saw different shifts in emphasis politically, and then we had Medicare, and then we started to see an unwinding, if anything, of the social contract. And it seems to me that this concept of Social Security, maybe with small s's, was a kind of flag to march under for building a better society. And somehow along the way, we dropped the flag, and Social Security today is very popular among the American people, but maybe we've lost the sense of what it stands for aspirationally. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting because I wouldn't use the word but. It is very popular, and I think we can build on it to make it the vision that President Roosevelt had for it. And I believe we're at a moment in history, and that's really what we talk about in our book. We have a plan that talks about paid family leave, which is now being talked about in Congress, children's benefits, children's allowances, rather. There are paid sick leave, which is something they were talking about in the 1930s, because it's not, and also short-term disability and as well as long-term disability. There are all kinds of benefits that fit within the rubric. And as I say, unemployment insurance was part of the Social Security Act, although we don't think of it as
Right.
Social Security today. But as you say, it really goes much further. Back then, they talked about you needed basic education. So the idea of free public college fits within the rubric of what I think you're right, the flag of Social Security. And we've somewhat lost that meaning, but I don't think it's lost forever. I think it can be once again expanded, because I think that is what it's about. Old age survivors disability insurance, wage replacement when a worker becomes old and no longer works and retires, a worker who becomes so disabled that that worker can't work anymore and support a family, or dies leaving dependents, are all extremely important. And that's what our current Social Security system covers. But there are many other situations where we need that kind of basic foundational economic security, as I say, including education, including universal health insurance, which was something that the Roosevelt administration almost proposed in 1935. And just, again, they wanted to start out more carefully, more incrementally, so didn't. So we've kind of taken a long, just 4 years after Social Security was enacted, it was enacted with old age benefits, survivors' benefits were added. So there was this effort of building on that cornerstone. But then, of course, we entered World War II. Republicans gained control. Corporations got stronger and fought back a lot of the issues to make Social Security more generous. But I think we're at a moment in history, thanks to the pandemic, where people see how much better off we'd have if we had those kinds of benefits.
And I think that, one of the contributions your book makes, and certainly Nancy Altman, one of the contributions your work in general makes, is in providing, you have, and the book includes a lot of tremendously detailed information about the history of Social Security, the arguments against it and why they're wrong and how to refute them. A lot of data packed into this book, and certainly your own knowledge and experience. But to me, it all begins with the vision, and that you build support based on the vision. And if I may take, if you'll permit me, Nancy, to just take a little, I think, not irrelevant historical detour here. Obviously, the chief articulator for the Social Security vision was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Harvey J. Kaye, the historian, who's among other things an FDR specialist, comes on this program a lot. And he recently published the collected speeches of FDR on democracy. And I hope you're still with me on this, but I was particularly struck by a throwaway phrase in a speech that FDR gave in 1910 when he was running for the state Senate, very early in his career. And he said something, I don't have it in front of me, but about that it's not only individuals who have liberties and rights, communities have liberties and rights as well. And to me, and this was like, Harvey doesn't, he single it out in his book, is kind of out of hundreds of pages. This is what leapt out at me. And I see, and I want your thoughts on this, a through line from there to the vision of Social Security that, we have a very kind of atavistic political philosophy on the right. Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, they're just individuals. But FDR, and I think this is part of the Social Security vision, I think there's a way to challenge that by saying we collectively have liberties too, and you are impinging on them if you do not allow us to work together for mutual benefit and security. Am I onto anything here?
Absolutely. Oh, you absolutely are. Just as an aside, I think it's worth going back and reading many of FDR's speeches. They really could be given today. They are so timely in the way that he saw the world. In addition to the vision of Social Security, I think it's important to really highlight and amplify the values that underlie Social Security, and they're connected, so that the Americans have, and these are basic American values. We hear a lot about, and of course it's important, individual liberty and freedom and all of that, and that's an important, that's embodied within Social Security. President Eisenhower called it the best example of sturdy self-reliance. But there's also, and this tends to get underplayed, is there's a communitarian value too. The era of barn raising, that you live in a small community and someone's has a fire and everybody comes and contributes. When we have floods or disasters, we don't go, okay, well, they're on their own. No, we all pitch in. We have a Red Cross that we contribute to. We have the government come in, and individuals will drive and help people, because we have a sense that we are connected and we have different ways of connecting. The obvious, most basic connection is within our families, however we define our families. Sometimes we define our families as our closest friends, but however, there are various ways of defining family. But whoever we think of as our loved ones, the ones we are close to, we of course have sense of commitment for each of us. And, the idea that you can't be doing well if a member of your family is not doing well. We're all connected and we all lift the whole idea of John F. Kennedy, a rising tide lifts all boats. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that in our economy, but that is the concept, that we have a shared prosperity. And the thing that is so outrageous, and so it would be laughable if it weren't so upsetting, is the effort of opponents of Social Security to set seniors against children and children against seniors. I mean, the idea that grandchildren should resent their grandparents because they're getting some Social Security is absurd. That the reality is that families rise or fall together. Grandparents are not doing well if their grandchildren don't have enough to eat. And grandchildren are not doing well if their grandparents are homeless on the street. So we're all connected. It's the very point you're saying, and it's the point you're making about Franklin Roosevelt, that with that community and those values come rights. They got their responsibilities, but there are also rights that come with it. And part of the right is this communitarian right, that we all contribute and we all prosper together.
And it's interesting, Nancy, because the very fact that people have been able to manipulate this and create this friction between generations, sort of greedy geezers versus millennials or whatever, is an indication that we have yet to achieve Social Security with lowercase s's in its broadest vision, right? Because if millennials or younger people were truly secure in the knowledge that they would never starve, that they will be provided for, because we are a society that does that for each other, you wouldn't be able to turn them against the notion of retired people having some small level of income. And in so many other ways, as you were talking, I was envisioning a society where people did have that sense of security and could pursue their own dreams, their own visions, and not feel threatened by the security of others.
The good news is that polling appears to show that this is a cynical Washington tactic, but it doesn't work. That the younger you are, the more you believe the benefits won't be there, because that's what you've been hearing for your whole life. But if you ask the follow-up question, well, do you think they should be cut? The answer is no, because they understand the value of it. In fact, a colleague, Alice Hoffman, whose father was Nelson Cruikshank, who was in the AFL-CIO in the 1950s and very instrumental in getting disability benefits enacted into law and so forth, was in a congregate living center in outside Philadelphia. And she told me the story that their representative came and talked to them and said about Social Security and said, don't worry, we're not going to touch anybody's benefits who are over age 55, which is sort of the common way of divide and conquer. And she raised her hand and said, you've just insulted all of us. We are fighting not for our own benefits. We're fighting for our children's benefits. And she got a standing ovation, and the congressman never came back.
Well, good.
It is a kind of cynical ploy, but I think it misjudges all of us. And it's kind of insulting to think that, yes, it's Alan Simpson, the former senator from Wyoming, said, oh, these greedy geezers, they don't care a whit about their grandchildren. I've never met anyone who doesn't care about their grandchildren. It just is not the way most Americans think. And yet it's a kind of cynical effort to divide and conquer.
And what is just before we close the door on greedy geezers, as a concept, what is the average, let's say, woman's monthly benefit for Social Security? $1,100 or so?
Yes. It's no one is getting rich on Social Security. That is for sure. I mean, that's why we want to expand the benefits, because people really cannot make ends meet on current Social Security. And you are right. Women, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community are particularly, Social Security is particularly important to those groups because they're less likely to have, they've earned lower amounts, they've been discriminated in the workplace, they're less likely to have other assets, to have private pensions and so forth. And yet their benefits are extremely low, so that it really is a time to expand all of these benefits. Social Security, it's often, this is another sort of cynical Washington ploy, it's billed as a problem. The reality is that Social Security is a solution.
Yes, and you make that point very effectively in your book, and also make the point effectively that for decades it was growing, it was being built upon, and that this was a bipartisan understanding in this. Not that I worship bipartisanship, but it was in fact a bipartisan understanding in this country. Dwight Eisenhower's Republican Party boasted in its 1956 platform of adding 2 million workers to Social Security and so on. And obviously, as we mentioned already, Nancy Altman, that passed, that era, got kind of flatlined a little bit, but is getting revived now. Circumstances are ripe for its revival. And along those lines, I want to spend a little time talking about what you and Eric Kingson describe as the All Generations Plan, which is your proposal for expanding Social Security. I guess I should preface by saying I'm happy that Democrats are talking about the modest expansions to the program, but to me, those, while valuable, are no, I don't want to dismiss them by saying transactional, but they're not necessarily resonating with that big vision. So, but I think your All Generations Plan does. So do you mind describing it a little bit?
Absolutely. I'd be delighted to, because I think you're right. I think the mainstream Democrats are on the right track, which is they want to expand, but they're just not looking, they don't have that vision. They're not looking far enough. At the same time, they're talking about expanding private pensions and so forth, and they just don't have that vision. Eric and I, my co-author Eric Kingson and I, really started with the assumption that the current patchwork system of retirement income that we have is really an historical accident. It was not someone sitting there designing, what would be a good system to have? You would never have come up with what we have. What works is Social Security. What doesn't work, what's disappearing, are traditional private sector plans, and which are totally inadequate are the savings plans in the form of 401ks. So given that, if you were designing a plan from the beginning, what you would do is make Social Security fully adequate so that it didn't need supplementation, so that we all contributed to it and we all drew out from it. So that was the premise, and that's what we do. So we raise benefits across the board. Most experts think you need about 70% of pre-retirement pay to be able to stop working and maintain your standard of living for the rest of your life, which is the concept behind retirement income. You don't need 100% because you don't have work expenses. You may be drawing down savings. You don't need 100%. The lower income you are because you've had less discretionary income as you worked, need a somewhat higher percentage. Very wealthy need a somewhat lower percentage. And that's the one thing we do. We increase benefits across the board so that everybody has around 70%, more for the lowest income and a little bit less for the highest income. The current system is such that if you decide to retire before your full retirement age, your benefits are reduced. The concept is that you're getting them for a longer amount of time. It's supposed to be actuarially neutral. But it was put in place in the 1950s, and it really is not actuarially neutral. It really penalizes those who are forced to retire early, which tend to be people who are working in physically demanding jobs, women who take time out to care for aging relatives and so forth. So we soften the reductions so the reductions aren't as big. That's what we do. And doing that, raising those benefits, because there's a single benefit formula, it also raises the benefits for workers who are disabled and their families and for survivors. So it raises benefits in all those categories. Then on top of it, we have some targeted increases because there are still pockets of poverty, especially low income, the idea that you shouldn't have to work for full-time for a lifetime and retire into poverty. So we increase those. And we have some additional protections because what Social Security, the incremental reform was to begin to cover everyone, and that was done in the 1950s. It was also to increase the level of benefits, and benefits continued to be increased by Congress till 1972, and they haven't been increased by Congress since then, and to add protections. So there was old age benefits, then there were survivor benefits, then there were long-term disability benefits, then was the start on Medicare for All, which was benefits for seniors, and then in 1972, benefits for people who were disabled. But that's when progress stopped. I mean, we should lower the Medicare age. We should put in a Medi-Kids program. We should have paid family leave. We should have children's allowances. We should have sick pay. There are lots of kinds of benefits, short-term disability that should be added. And we are wealthy. We are so much wealthier now than we were in 1935. We are wealthier than we were in 1939, 1956, 1965, 1972, when all these benefits were expanded and added. It may not feel that we're wealthier because we have such income and wealth inequality. It's back to where it was in the 1920s. But we are wealthy, and as long as we have the wealthy pay their fair share, we can afford all those benefits. And in fact, that's how we pay for these expansions primarily. We restore Social Security to long-range balance so it can pay all benefits in full and on time through the 21st century and beyond.
You know, one of the things that's implicit in everything you've said, and I know you, like I, support Medicare for All as well. Well, one of the things that's implicit in everything you've said, including the employer-based retirement system and so on, one of the aspects of this debate that gets overlooked, I think, a lot is that whether it's employer health benefits or employer retirement benefits, pensions, and so on, essentially, when we have a system that puts the responsibility for something like retirement security or healthcare in the hands of an employer, you're giving that responsibility to someone who has a powerful incentive to work against the objective of that program in order to save money. The less money dispersed to the public, which is the whole point to create financial security, the more the employers benefit financially. So you've created a kind of inbuilt tension unless you do something like this.
Absolutely. And and aside from that, it's also incredibly inefficient. Insurance is most efficient when you can you can have as large a risk pool as possible, and you have no adverse selection. And that's only the federal government. But you are absolutely right. The advocates for worker security at the turn of the 20th century, who really were the ones who finally succeeded in getting Social Security enacted, were extremely distrustful of private employer plans. They saw them as employer efforts to control their workforce, which is pretty much what they were. It was a way to keep their most productive employees from leaving and going to their competitors, because they had them tied, because they had to, if they wanted to get this deferred compensation, they had to remain. It just makes zero sense. It's just not an efficient way to do it. Part of what is the mythology, and it's the reason that that conservatives so hate Social Security, is it puts the lie to the idea that everything in the private sector works better than the public sector, and what you need is competition for the best results. That's just not true in every situation. We don't have a competitive military. We have a common military that's publicly funded, and the same thing is true with Social Security and Medicare. They are much more efficient. Less than a penny of every dollar spent is spent on administration. You cannot find that level of efficiency in the private sector, in any kind of private sector insurance. The same thing's true with Medicare. You're covering seniors and people with disabilities, those who have the most claims, who have the most draw on healthcare on average. And yet Medicare is much more efficient than its private sector counterparts. So there are certain things, if we're talking about making cell phones, the private sector is great, and we should be all for it. But if you're talking about providing this basic economic security, there's a reason we have a minimum wage, which should be raised, because you cannot just leave that to the private sector. There's uneven bargaining and so forth. And that's why we all come together collectively through our government, which President Roosevelt called an instrumentality that we're using to provide ourselves with this basic economic security.
Well, I'm not sure how great the private sector is at building cell phones.
Okay, maybe I'm
but it's a selling clothing. I always use the example of selling clothing. The government doesn't have to open a boutique in every neighborhood, right? I mean, that's not what the government does. But there are economies of scale, right? There are also, if you have competition in areas where you can't compete because the benefits are essentially fixed, then
or the cost is too high to enter. Yes.
Yeah. Always. And if you have to start worrying about who's in which plan when, and then you get into tracking eligibility and enrollment, or all these things come with costs. And universal programs are very easy to support, get political support for, because everybody knows about them, everybody supports them. And going back to the point we started with, nobody's going to try to deceive you or mislead you for economic gain, because they don't have any economic incentive to do so. So
and they're totally portable from job to job. I mean, You want a system. And that's why at the time, so the architects of Social Security were looking at them. They were really concerned that a federal program like Social Security was going to be declared unconstitutional, but they could not make it work even on a state level, because over a 40-year career, you might have a number of different jobs in various states, and you can't be claiming from every state. There is just an efficiency, and it just makes sense. And it's why Social Security works so well and why it is so popular.
And it gets to, and maybe we'll make this the last point, Nancy Altman, but it gets to another great point that you and Eric Kingston make, which jumped out at me, which was the notion that what Social Security both as we understand it and in the broader sense, does, among other things, it doesn't just, reflect our communal values. It also enables individuality and is consistent with our culture of individuality. And this multi-state, the issues with the multi-state and moving from job to job and state to state are a perfect example of that. It gives people, how many times have we heard people say, especially before the Affordable Care Act, but still even now, I can't leave my job because I need the coverage, or, the great, I'm not vested in my pension yet, and so I can't leave. That our right to individual liberties, big conservative rallying point, are enhanced when we have true Social Security, because I can tell my boss, take this job and shove it, as the old song goes, or I can just decide I want to live in Arizona, whatever it is. I've got more freedom with genuine Social Security than I do otherwise, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, if you want to be an entrepreneur and you want to really have an idea for a new product or something, and you want to take your savings and try to make a go for it, I mean, it would be much better if we had guaranteed universal health insurance. That would really make it easier. But at least the whole concept behind Social Security, it's in the very name, is that it's supposed to provide us a sense of security, a sense of peace of mind, that if things don't go well, you've got something there. That's why we have unemployment insurance, which should be federalized and improved, but it was part of the original Social Security Act. It's supposed to provide us this basic level of security that if all else goes wrong, it's there for us. And I think you're exactly right. And that's why Dwight Eisenhower, a conservative Republican president, talked about it as the best example embodiment of sturdy self-reliance. It's that idea of we can venture out and try our ideas, and we know that if whatever happens, we'll be protected. We'll have some security.
Well, maybe we ought to take the Gadsden flag, the don't tread on me, and make it the new Social Security logo.
I like that.
Get the right, on board. You can't tell me what to do. I've got Social Security.
I like that.
All right. Well, Nancy Altman, thanks again. I will show this book once more for those who are watching. Social Security works. Social Security works for everyone, protecting and expanding the insurance Americans love and count on. Nancy Altman, thank you for writing it. And as always, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.